Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for joining us here. I think we're at time, so we can go ahead and get started. My name is Rebecca Griffiths. I'm going to be our facilitator for this session, which is about learning to scale. We are one of the networks that Dr. Albro mentioned, a networked initiative to prepare evidence-based practices and products for scaling. So I'm going to just give a little bit of background about this network and ask my fellow panelists to introduce themselves and their projects before we get into the interactive discussion part of our session. I will just quickly say I have with me here today Heather Aiken from the University of North Carolina, Lauren Artsy from the American Institutes for Research, Mary Bratch-Hines from the University of Florida, Lynn Fuchs and Tony Smith, also from AIR, and Margaret Troyer from the SERP Institute, all PIs within this Learn network. Before I jump into a little bit of background, I wanted to ask our program officer, Erin Higgins. We were happy to have join us, just to say a couple words, maybe reflecting on what Liz said earlier about the goals of this project and what it means for IES.
Hey everybody, it's great to be able to see the list of people joining us now. So welcome to our session. IES is really excited to have established this network this fiscal year. The Learn Network, which stands for Leveraging Evidence to Accelerate Recovery Nationwide, arose from a need to address two big needs in the education sector. First, resources to support recovery for students in K-12, particularly those from underrepresented groups who were disproportionately affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. And second, to establish successful processes and methods for supporting the scaling of evidence-based products intended for use in schools. As we all know, there's an urgent need to put to use all the tools in the education science toolbox to accelerate learning and address gaps in student achievement, especially those gaps exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, and in particular for students who have been historically underserved by the system who were disproportionately affected by the pandemic. And one of the tools that we have is existing products that demonstrate positive impacts on student learning, and scaling those products needs to be a priority. So with this network, we hope to enable adaptations and preparations for scaling for existing products, 3 focused on accelerating literacy for students, and 1 focused on improving fractions knowledge for students. And in addition to that, we're hoping that the combined efforts of this network is going to lead to the establishment of best practices for the field to how to effectively scale evidence-based products. And so with that, I'll turn it back to Rebecca. And I think it's going to be a really engaging session where we'll learn a lot more about what the network hopes to accomplish.
Thank you, Erin. Well, you just did a lot of my introductory work for me. Just to quick summarize what Erin just said, our purpose is really to support the adaptation and scaling of evidence-based practices and products to help educators address the negative impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on learning and educational equity. And we sort of think of ourselves also as working towards building capacity in the education research community to design and develop educational interventions, products, and programs that are really prepared or positioned for scaling from the start. So to introduce some new ways of thinking about how we go about that task. And I'll just reiterate, within the network, SRI International is the lead organization. We have 4 research teams who are going to meet in a minute. Some of you might have attended a session last year that was led by some of my colleagues, presenting the findings from a previous project that was a partnership between SRI and IES, which was kind of started to explore how some of the approaches SRI has used to scale or to move inventions from the lab to the market over many years might apply to education research. So if you were in that presentation last year, then some of what we're going to share today might sound familiar. A core pillar of our approach is what we call the Invent, Apply, Transition framework. Again, SRI has used this to scale many kinds of inventions. You might be familiar with Siri, which was a technology developed within SRI, which we scaled by licensing it to Apple. There are many, many examples, less well-known examples of technologies and other kinds of inventions that we've developed that we have brought to market, often through either licensing agreements or by spinning out new enterprises. The IAT framework incorporates concepts that are probably more familiar in sort of commercial or entrepreneurial spheres, such as value propositions and minimum viable products and rapid stereotyping. And so part of what we're trying to do is to think about how to adapt some of these concepts to apply in education, to incorporate some of the values and the goals that are sort of central to the work that we do, but that also can help researchers and developers think about how to position their innovations from scale in new ways. Just to dive a little bit into these concepts, invent is the process of ideation and spending time understanding the use case and the need for what you're designing. The goal here is to invent a solution concept that's likely to meet an unmet need among the intended users, which are in our case often teachers. They could be other educators, maybe even students. We've noted that many education research projects start from a theory of change, addressing a societal need, such as reducing inequities in educational opportunities or expanding the pipeline of diverse teachers. So in some cases, focusing on an unmet need among practitioners might involve a sort of reorientation of design principles, from sort of solving a problem that's a general problem for society to sort of what does this look like in the day-to-day lives of the people who are working on this problem. This can also involve, or should also involve, building a deep understanding of user needs and context from the start. Apply sets out to prove the solution, for example, through, in our case, efficacy testing, and to show potential applications. A key element of apply is to get to product user fit, in which one demonstrates that an innovation satisfies the need of its principal direct users. So this is often done through a proof of concept. Then in transition, the transition phase is all about getting the route to market, which in our world we might think of as getting your innovation into a meaningful number of schools, addressing a sort of getting to widespread use among students. This is where you demonstrate that the technology satisfies the needs of all stakeholders, or all the stakeholders that are really critical to the effective implementation and adoption of your project, and thereby those of a larger strategic segment of a market. As I said, at least in SRI's experience, there are really two main paths to this transition, either licensing intellectual property, the product or program that you've designed, to another entity that has the infrastructure in place to take it to scale, or launching a new organization to build that infrastructure. The IAT framework identifies a number of key factors to support researchers in thinking about scaling innovations, such as convenience. How easy or hard is it for educators to incorporate this evidence-based practice or product into their school or district environment? This is a factor that I think as researchers, we may not get to until sort of pretty far down the road, and then find out that it is actually a really important factor in decisions about adoption, maybe more than we might have expected. Scope, is this a comprehensive solution or an add-on to other curricula? A lot of education research projects tend to focus on a fairly narrowly defined problem. And so trying to figure out how to address the needs of educators for a comprehensive solution, if that's what districts are looking for, requires another step. And then there's transitioning. How can this evidence-based practice or product be brought to market, given the scope and the ways in which districts and schools make decisions? There is, as many of you know, a large, extensive body of literature about scaling innovative programs and products in education. Researchers, I think in our field, tend to focus on factors that can influence implementation fidelity and efficacy, such as the extent of local adaptation. We're also concerned with sustainability, which hinges in large part on local buy-in and identifying champions. We think that IAT can complement these approaches by helping researchers think about how to shift from advancing your theory of change to solving a problem of practice, but still needing to attend to all of those kinds of factors that other researchers have identified as being really important for effective scaling of a product or practice. So we're working on it in this project over the next couple of years. We'll be working on adapting our frameworks to best support scaling educational innovations, in part by integrating principles from liberatory design framework and implementation science, which we think will be really beneficial in ensuring that products are relevant and useful for the communities that they are designed to serve. So with that, I'm going to ask my colleagues on the panel to start to introduce each of their teams briefly. Oops. I think I have, sorry. I think I have the wrong version of the slides here. Carrie, do you have the correct slides handy?
Yes, give me just a second. I can pull it up.
I'm sorry about that. I think I have. Thank you, Carrie.
All right, you see them now?
Yep.
Okay, great.
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much, Rebecca and the SRI team, as well as Aaron and the IES team for awarding the targeted reading instruction, or TRI, to be part of this network, which has been an amazing opportunity for us. My name is Mary Brad Hines. I'm at the University of Florida, and I want to acknowledge my team members on the call: Heather Aiken, who is a co-PI of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where TRI was developed, will also be co-presenting with me today. We also have Wei Li on the call with us, and then some team members and co-PIs who weren't able to be here: Paige Pullen, Walter Lecce, Teresa Taylor, Danielle Pico, and Bryn Humphrey are really instrumental in the work that we're doing. If you can advance the slide, please. So as you can see from this timeline, TRI was developed starting in 2005. So just 3 years after IES started, TRI started to receive funding, and we have actually received continuous funding from IES since then. So if we think about what TRI is, it was developed really in an effort to help support rural educators in schools that may not have had a lot of support. We're talking early elementary teachers who don't have teaching assistants, who might not have special educators, certainly don't have instructional facilitators or people to really guide their implementation of high quality reading support for students. And so TRI was developed to really help that space. And so teachers who have historically implemented TRI receive initial training and then weekly virtual coaching in how to use the evidence-based scope and sequence that TRI created. We've been tracking the science of reading literature since before that was a term. And so we've always incorporated these evidence-based practices and how teachers can most effectively teach young students how to gain those foundational reading skills. In every 15-minute TRI lesson that a teacher does with an individual student, students segment and blend real words, they write, they learn word meanings, which we think is incredibly important to build that background knowledge. They read connected texts and they learn comprehension strategies. All of these studies that you see on the timeline, they've been randomized controlled trials, and we've been able to show how effective TRI is at improving student fluency, decoding, and reading comprehension. And this is just, teachers implement TRI with students for just 6 to 10 weeks of lessons. So we're not talking even dozens of hours of implementation. We're talking 4 to 6 hours of supplemental reading instruction from a highly qualified implementer of TRI, and that really shows impacts. And what Works Clearinghouse confirmed TRI's effectiveness in a single study review. The Learn project has been an incredible opportunity for us. We have long wanted to scale TRI, and we'll be talking about that throughout this whole presentation. And what we're able to do through Learn Network is we're taking TRI, which is historically a very paper pencil, we call it very analog version, and we're putting it on a digital platform called the Flamingo Reading app, which was developed at the University of Florida Lastinger Center, where I now work, in the spring of 2020, really to help teachers, as we all needed to pivot during that time, to provide high quality virtual reading instruction to students. So TRI on the Flamingo Reading app provides an interactive web-based whiteboard for teachers to use. Our TRI books and lessons, and all of this can be shared directly with students.
Heather is going to talk more about our specific Learn project. You can advance to the next slide. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary. So as Mary said, we've really spent time since September transitioning everything that was paper and pencil TRI into the Flamingo Literacy Reading app to make the TRI Flamingo Reading app. I'm going to start calling it TRI FRA because one of the things I realized as we prepared for this is that that name is way too long for me because I'm used to saying 3 letters. So adding all of this is a lot. I think we can go ahead and advance. So one of the things that we're doing is as we put these things into the digital platform, we're realizing that a lot of the other elements of what we've always done are going to change as well. And so one of those things is we're anticipating that we will have shorter training times. Our traditional model, we do 12 hours of face-to-face professional development for teachers. We are anticipating doing as little as 3 hours of virtual training. We're also providing some asynchronous training. And so we're really exploring some of those different models. Advanced slide, please. We've always provided virtual coaching for our teachers as they implemented TRI with a student. Coaches would Zoom in or FaceTime in or however we could web conference in for 1 lesson a week. And in our exploration, we are anticipating being able to spend a little less time on that coaching piece. And part of that is because if we advance the slide, please, our coaching is going to be able to be more focused on the diagnostic reading instruction piece. And what we mean by that is the reading app is going to contain all of the basic implementation elements, which is going to allow us to move directly into focusing on what students need and supporting teachers or educators as they implement for their students, which is the most powerful piece of our coaching. So it's going to take away the heavy burden of just making sure implementation is consistent and we're able to move into stronger instruction. Advanced slide, please. And the last thing that the app is offering us is it's offering us greater flexibility. And so we are able to expand how we offer TRI. Traditionally, it's been a teacher sitting right next to a student. With this digital format, it makes virtual implementation that much easier if we should ever need that again, hopefully not for a very, very long time. But it's also allowing us to expand our pool of potential implementers. As we said previously, we've always worked with classroom teachers. In our upcoming pilot studies this summer, we're working with 2 districts, one in Kentucky, one in Florida, and we're supporting their implementation of reading instruction during their summer school programs. And we will be working with high school students who are working as volunteer tutors, paraprofessionals, classroom teachers, interventionists, and then also a college level tutoring program. So our implementers suddenly are going to run the gamut. And we're working on figuring out how we adapt everything to support all of those different populations. And I think that is us. So we'll turn it over. Thank you.
Thanks. My name is Lauren Artsy, and I'm at the American Institutes for Research. The project that I will be talking about today is a partnership between AIR and University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. We have a really wonderful team across both organizations. Douglas Fuchs, Elena Venegas, and Stephen Chamberlain are the other investigators in this work. And across both institutions, we work with a large team of coaches, project managers, and researchers who support the implementation of this project. So the project that I'm talking about is called Peer-Assisted Learning Strategies in Reading with Differentiation. We call it PALS-RD, and we are seeking to adapt PALS for reading at 4th grade. I'll describe PALS first, and then I'll talk about our adaptations. The existing PALS program, Peer-Assisted Learning Strategy, is a class-wide peer tutoring program that supplements the classroom's core reading curriculum. Its main activities include components such as partner reading, summarizing, retelling, prediction. And the idea is that pairs of students work together to go through these components And they switch roles as reader and coach. So they're sometimes each get to be a reader, each also get to be a coach helping their partner. So in this work, PALS RD, we're basically adapting PALS in two ways. So the first piece of our work is we are including the use of a differentiation kit that includes a routine to support students with multisyllabic decoding and language. So to give some additional support to some of the pairs who may need additional support related to multisyllabic decoding and language. We're also weaving in a curriculum-based measure called the Maze CBM, where it's administered every other week and it monitors more closely students' progress. So the data from the Maze can support teachers in informing how they pair students together to ensure that the right pairs are working together at the right level, and also how they differentiate the program. Some students will receive the differentiation kit, other students receive the final component of PALS. If you go to the next slide, in this year, we've implemented the full PALS RD program in one district. It was really a pilot year where we're looking at usability and feasibility of the program. The teachers actually just finished this implementation cycle last week. So we're in the process of conducting post-intervention interviews with the teachers. And following this year, we're moving pretty quickly into our year 2, where we're actually scaling the research and we're evaluating PALS in a pretty large scale RCT. We're aiming to be in 80 classrooms across multiple districts. And we're also conducting some of the preparation to scale activities to understand stakeholder mapping, market sizing, and segmentation. And I'll talk about those later. I think that's it.
Okay. Hi, I'm Margaret Troyer. I am with the SERP Institute, and today I'm here to talk about STARI, which is the Strategic Adolescent Reading Intervention. So STARI is a reading intervention for students in grades 6 through 9 who read 2 or more years below grade level. STARI was developed through a partnership between SERP, Harvard University, Wheelock College, and Boston Public Schools, in response to a problem of practice posed by Boston Public Schools, which is that students couldn't comprehend their textbooks when they got to high school. So we realized that we needed to intervene in middle school, and this program was developed. It was piloted in Boston Public Schools. It was revised and then eventually evaluated. STARI is a teacher-led discussion-based program. STARI is aligned with the science of reading. It addresses both the word recognition and the language comprehension strands. And one way in which STARI differs from other reading interventions is in its attention to student motivation and engagement. STARI offers 3 full years worth of curriculum materials, roughly aligned to the 3 middle school grades. So it is a tier 2 program, but it is a full year-long complete curriculum. And we also offer a comprehensive professional learning series for teachers. And now, after pandemic-related school closures, there are more 6th through 9th graders who read 2 or more years below grade level than ever before. And the need to accelerate learning for those students is greater than ever before. And at the time that we applied for this, the Learn Network was seeking products with evidence of effectiveness that have not yet reached scale. And that is exactly what we are. So we had a statistically significant impact on students' scores on the Read Basics assessment in the study in Massachusetts in 13-14, which was also funded by IES. And more recently, we had an impact on STARI students' state test scores in Mississippi in 21-22. So given those results, we applied to join the Learn Network to try to figure out how to effectively scale up STARI outside the context of research studies. And STARI is an open education resource that is freely downloadable from our website. So if you're interested in learning more about STARI, I would encourage you to visit our website and investigate the program. And I will stop there and pass to the next team.
Hi, everyone. My picture is not up there yet, I don't think, but this is Lynn Fuchs. I'm from the American Institute for Research and from Vanderbilt University. And Tony Smith, who will be speaking a little bit later, is the PI of this project. And what we're doing, we're working in math, which makes us a unique member of this network. And we are combining 2 existing practices, each with research-based evidence. And we are focusing on CFI at grade 5. CFI is class-wide fraction intervention, which is based on a validated small group fractions intervention, which is known as fractions face-off, and then in its most updated version, known as super solvers. And super solvers is validated at grades 4 and 5. And in this project, it's being used as a class-wide intervention with a classroom teacher conducting a brief fractions lesson each session. Then the teacher divides the class into pairs for guided rehearsal and explanations on that day's topic. And the third component of every session has students doing independent work on the day's content. So CFI is the component of our innovation that's focused on accelerating student learning and grade level material. And fractions is a central part of the intermediate mathematics grade level curriculum. And so what we're doing to address simultaneously not only acceleration through the curriculum is using peer-assisted learning strategies, or PALS, in math in combination with CFI. So we recognize there's been a lot of unfinished learning as a function of the pandemic's remote instruction year. And there are a lot of pockets of missing skills for students who are in the same classroom. And the nature of those topics is different for different pairs. So the teacher divides the children into partners for work on topics that span grades 2 through 6 that address the students' individual learning needs and allows the teachers to engage in rich levels of differentiation. So what we're doing in this project and in the Learn Network is we're assessing the potential of an adapted version of CFI plus PALS that's designed to accelerate learning in a quasi-experimental study. And we're also conducting market analysis and interviews with practitioners outside of study schools. And the goal is to prepare CFI plus PALS to be scaled at grade 5, primarily in Title I schools. And Tony will be telling you more about the quasi-experiment and mostly the scaling portions of our Learn work within this network in a few minutes. There you see the two practices that I've described. CFI, class-wide fraction intervention, is designed to accelerate learning by supporting mastery of the grade level curriculum. And PALS, peer-assisted learning strategies, addresses the pandemic learning loss by supporting mastery of math topics from prior grades.
Okay, thank you all. So those were as an introduction to the 4 product teams that are part of the network and the sort of overarching objectives and theories that we're bringing to these challenges. What I'm going to do now is to pose 2 sort of broad questions to the product teams and invite them to each respond to how they're thinking about these questions in the context of their projects. But I would also like to invite members of our participants to submit questions that are sort of in line with either of these 2 questions, and then we will also save some time at the end for additional questions or more free conversation. So my first question for the product teams is how your project is thinking about scaling for this project in ways that might be different from what you've done on previous IES funded projects or other research projects. So are you thinking differently about scaling in terms of your vision, your aspirations, in terms of the way you're thinking about barriers to scaling? What are some ways that you might be approaching your work differently in the context of this network? And I'm going to ask Margaret to start us off.
Sure. So you heard from Rebecca, you heard from Erin, that sort of the purpose of the Learn Network was to address the issue that education researchers have developed these promising products and interventions with evidence of effectiveness, but often they don't scale. And that's exactly where STARI is. I said that before. We have evidence of efficacy from randomized controlled trials, but we haven't really scaled up nationally. And how we think about scaling, when we think about sort of our ambition is we would like to be as well known as the other secondary reading interventions that folks are familiar with. So we'd like it if when a district chooses their reading intervention, they at least consider STARI. We may not be the right intervention for every district, but we'd like to at least be on the list. And since STARI is an open education resource and it's freely downloadable from our website, we don't actually have a way to track who is using STARI. We know anecdotally that STARI is being used in hundreds of schools all across the country. Users have to register to download STARI. They have to register for a free account on our website or for one of SERP's other products. And we can track the number of downloads. But just because someone registers and downloads STARI, that doesn't really tell us much. They could download STARI materials and then never look at them again, or they could download, print, and distribute materials for use across an entire district. And the download doesn't tell us. So the real difference between this project and anything we've ever done before is that this project allowed us to focus time and energy on collecting information from our users about how they're using STARI and if they're using STARI. So the first thing we set out to do was to survey our users and our non-users as well about whether and how they're using STARI. So in fall of 22, close to the beginning of this school year, we sent out a survey to a subset of the email addresses that we had from people who have downloaded STARI, and we asked them, are you using STARI? Why or why not? So whether they ultimately decided to use STARI or not, what went into that decision-making process so that we could kind of try to understand what the market's looking for and the extent to which we are meeting that need. And then for those survey participants who indicated that they are using STARI in the 22-23 school year, we've followed up with 3 additional surveys. So one in the fall, one in the winter, and we've just sent out our spring survey and we're getting responses back right now. And Rebecca also mentioned the IAT or Invent, Apply, Transition framework. So that's something that we've been using as a part of this network. And we've learned that when we think about the scalability of our intervention, we need to think about performance, reliability, convenience, and cost. So when you think about performance, we have good performance, we have efficacy data demonstrating that STARI students outperform control students, both on the Read Basics, which is the ETS developed assessment that we use as part of our research studies, and also on state tests in Mississippi. And we also have a lot of qualitative evidence from teachers and students saying that they like the program and that STARI has helped students to learn to read better. So we've got performance and we have cost. STARI is free to download. And even once districts purchase the copyrighted literature that goes along with the program, and even if they choose to purchase pre-printed curriculum materials instead of printing in-house, and if they choose to purchase professional learning, which we hope they do, STARI is still significantly cheaper than most of the other secondary reading interventions out there. So we definitely have, the ability to compete on cost. And in terms of convenience, STARI might not be the absolute most convenient reading intervention that exists because it is a teacher-led intervention. It's not the sort of set the student on the computer and your work is done intervention, which we think is one of the strengths of STARI. But STARI teachers have spoken favorably about how clearly laid out our lesson plans are, that the program is straightforward to implement, even if you are not a reading specialist or interventionist. And now we have all of our professional learning online, so teachers can access it whenever and wherever they want to. So that also contributes to convenience. So what we have found in the data that we've gathered this year through our surveys, through observations and interviews as well, is that our biggest focus area currently is the reliability piece. Districts are doing very different things with STARI. So just as one example, we say that STARI needs to be scheduled for at least 45 minutes, 5 days a week, or an equivalent number of minutes. So some districts do 90 minutes on an A-day-B day, that's fine. But some districts are trying to do STARI in like 30 minutes, 3 days a week. And that's a problem because our data show that the more curriculum students are exposed to, the more they grow in their reading. So of course, less time means less curriculum exposure, means less growth. As another example, not all districts are choosing to purchase the professional learning, or even if they are purchasing it, they may not be requiring or incentivizing their teachers to complete it. So we have teachers who are not really trained implementing STARI and making adaptations to STARI that could be considered lethal mutations. So we've been working on developing a lot of tools that districts can use, like observation protocols for principals or administrators who are walking through classrooms. But again, the issue is, since we're an open education resource, people do not have to communicate with us before they choose to use STARI or while they use STARI. So even getting these resources in front of users' eyes, let alone getting them to use them, is a challenge. And so these are some of the things that we're working through as a part of the Learn Network in service of figuring out how to scale STARI and with the support of the team. And I'm out of time, so I will pass it to the next speaker at this point.
Thank you, Margaret. I did want to, we've got a couple questions from the audience. One very quick question, which I'll just throw out before we move along, which is whether you provide incentives for survey completions. I think conducting market research is somewhat different from scientific surveys that we're more used to conducting. And so I think it raises new questions about what's appropriate in terms of compensation or what's affordable.
Yes, we do. And we budgeted for this in our proposal. And so we give each user a $30 Amazon gift card after they complete each survey. And we work to keep the surveys under 20 minutes. So it's a fairly generous incentive for the amount of time that we're asking.
Thank you. There's another longer question, but I'm going to save this one until our other my other colleagues have had a chance to speak to this question. We'll come back to it. Can I ask Tony and Lynn to share your reflections of how this project, or how you're addressing scale or thinking about scale differently in the context of this project than you might have in the past?
Sure. I think similar to STARI, we have always thought about scaling in a lot of our projects, but what's different about this project is that there are resources directly reserved to focus on trying to figure out how to scale the product. In our case, we have 2 evidence-based strategies, CFI and PALS, and our focus is really in line with the Learn Network, trying to figure out how to get these evidence-based strategies to support math learning acceleration into our target market in more schools. And we've defined that target market as being Title I schools serving grade 5, where at least 50% of the students do not meet state standards. And so at the end of this project, one of the products that we're going to create is a scaling plan. So it's going to include sort of an idea or plans to scale this, to get it into more schools. And to develop that plan, we're going to do a bunch of different analyses that we might not typically do in one of our research projects. Specifically, we're going to analyze our target market segment, do a market differentiation analysis, and then interview stakeholders like district administrators, teachers that are outside of our study districts. We'll also talk to the folks that are participating in the quasi-experimental study that Lynn mentioned earlier, but we're going to talk also to folks who are outside of our study districts, get a broader perspective of how folks are thinking about some of these programs that they might adopt in their districts. And so we have sort of 4 broad questions around scaling that we're answering. One is, what's the size of the target market and what's the capacity needed to serve that market?
Mm-hmm.
How does CFI PALS differ from other programs that are focused on similar topics in upper elementary grades that are out there already? Who are the key stakeholders for championing that take up of those products and interventions across varied contexts within the target market, and how does CFI PALS meet the requirements of those key stakeholders in those different settings. So with all of that information together, we will develop sort of a plan for scaling. Rebecca asked about barriers, and we do anticipate some barriers in our efforts to think about scaling CFI plus PALS. And some of those are similar to what Starry had mentioned. The time that it takes to implement the strategies well and get evidence, for them to have an impact. Districts and schools don't have a lot of time for supplemental programs, and that's what we have been posing this as. And particularly work that's focused on a specific topic, as is the case for CFI. Also, there's competition for other strategies or products, particularly ed tech products where teachers can, differentiate by putting students onto an ed tech product and having them work through the activities in there. So we anticipate those as being some barriers to scaling, that these are other or competitors to some of the work that we might want to do more broadly. We are still kind of thinking through how we might react to those barriers, but we are right now, based on the work that we've done this year and just in general, thinking that sort of our pitch around those barriers would be that it really does take time to develop a strong foundation in math, and particularly in fractions, which is a consistent area of difficulty for students. And it's needed for future math coursework. So CFI has this evidence to really develop that foundation. And it incorporates a pretty strong instructional design around that, which may or may not be present in some of these ed tech platforms. And it supports teachers in developing their own understanding of fractions and fractions instruction along the way. Moreover, by having these structured opportunities for students to work together, CFI and PALS really does support understanding of math concepts, as well as comfort and skill in some of those peer-to-peer interactions that may not have been as well developed as a result of the pandemic, but even more broadly, it's something that students are working on throughout. And so that's sort of our approach to this. As I said, we're going to be doing more and more analyses and data collections around these questions to help develop that scaling plan.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And I think one part of that caught my attention that seems very unusual for the kind of research we do is your focus on sort of understanding the size of the market for the program or product that you're developing, and what it would take to build the infrastructure you would need to provide support and get CFI plus PALS out to that broad community. So that's really exciting. Lynn, did you have anything you want to add, or shall I turn to the TRI?
I just want to emphasize a point that maybe isn't yet clear, and that is that we are working with a current cohort of teachers in the year who are implementing both practices, and we're getting their ongoing input on the challenges that they face, the strategies that they use to incorporate to unfamiliar practices and get them running at the same time, the timing with which the two practices intersect with each other. And we're developing a manual for next year's quasi-experiment, which will provide a guide based on this year's cohort of teachers' input for how to implement this combined practice in a successful way. So that's part of our work scope and long-term scaling activities.
Thank you. I'm going to turn now to Mary and Heather. I think you've touched on some of your approaches to preparing to scale in your introduction, but is there any?
Yeah, we have. Yeah, so I think Tony set us up really well. A lot of what all of the projects are doing as part of the Learn Network is very similar in terms of looking at that, doing the market analysis and answering some of the questions. And so I'm going to take it in a slightly different direction than the other two teams. So as I noted, TRI has had research funding for almost 20 years. And And so it's like, why haven't we been able to scale in that amount of time? And so I'm going to talk as a researcher because that's what I'm really, really comfortable and familiar with. TRI has wanted to move out of research for as long as I've been working with TRI, and that's for over a decade. You know, we know we have a product that's really effective. We know teachers really like it. We have reams of anecdotal evidence about how they appreciate TRI and how they're helping their students learn. Sometimes it feels like for the first time, learn how to build those foundational reading skills. And so we know we want to see it to go to scale. And so this project is really allowing us to move towards that goal because we have supports through SRI. We're thinking about the marketability of the product rather than just how to create a study about it. We're really good at doing that part, right? And so it's this mix, this grant, you know, it's only 2 years. We have to pack a ton in for just 2 years. It's this mix of research, which we're really comfortable and familiar with, and business/marketing, which I will be honest, I'm very uncomfortable and unfamiliar with. And so we're getting a lot of supports to be able to do that. So our focus on convenience, cost, end user experience, market needs are kind of driving what we're doing in this project. And we're moving away from, or at least parallel to, what we call kind of our safety net of the university or college setting, which is important for us to do because we've had funding, but we've had constraints. So we've always had an extremely small team. I've called us small and mighty for a really long time, of people who implement and study TRI. I mean, we're talking right now, our implementation team is 2 people. So how do we go to scale across the country when we're starting from a pretty small implementation base of staff? Having grant funding for this long has meant we're able to offer TRI, quote unquote, for free to schools and districts and teachers. But of course, we know with research, there's a huge asterisk caveat associated with that. It means we've had to randomize teachers within schools. That means we're implementing in the context of randomized controlled trials. We don't know what it looks like to implement TRI at a whole school, whole district level. And so that's some of the, and we're not going to do that quite yet in this project, but we're hopefully going to be gaining more evidence about how to move to that point. And so always at the back of my mind is this question, like, what does it actually mean to go to scale? And for us, it is that we want our product in the hands of more teachers, but we're also, like Lynn and Tony were talking about, like, we're a supplemental reading program. How do districts need that? And I'm going to have Heather talk a little bit about that.
And I think that's one of the pieces that's also a little different as we move out of this pure research context, is that we suddenly have this flexibility to adapt to kind of what the market is looking for. I'm probably one of the newer members of the TRI team, and I'm like, it's year 6, I think. But ever since I've come in, we've been part of a replication type grant. So we haven't been able to make some of the changes maybe that we've been interested in making, because that would be substantially changing what the intervention itself is. So I think one of the things that's really exciting, but also simultaneously really scary, is that we have this opportunity to adapt and change what we're doing based on what people are looking for, or, maybe this is going to be a different group of implementers than we've ever had before. And so I think that is just a whole new perspective that this grant is giving us the opportunity to think about what different versions of TRI look like. And being able to really define and hone in on what is the essence of TRI and how do we translate that into what practically can be used and what the market really desires. And so I think that's really where we are. Exciting and scary at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think sort of turning your attention to how to get these evidence-based products and practices out to as many kids as possible at this time is really important, and great that you're doing this work. There's a bunch of questions that I want to pose to the group, but I do want to give Lauren a chance to speak to this question before we move on to another question. Lauren, are there points that you want to highlight from the perspective of PALS RD that have not come up as much in the other presenters?
Yeah, thanks. And I'll aim to be brief. So I wanted to build on Mary's comments that she just made about like there's kind of an aspect of almost like scaling within your research study, but also scaling in terms of, you know, the product and almost from like a business lens. So I'll kind of talk about briefly about both areas. So in our study, we're moving from this pilot year where we were implementing PALS RD in one district to moving across, you know, implementing in a fairly large scale RCT in 80 classrooms. So, you know, there's kind of that scaling aspect that we're undergoing immediately. And what we're finding is really having the relationships with local partners has been really important for us to kind of have to scale pretty quickly in terms of research. So again, our partner site at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley has been really instrumental in that work. They work within the local region where we're conducting the study. And so that's been a really important element to us. And also another thing that's kind of coming up in this work as well is thinking about how we're also, you know, as we're scaling the intervention, like how we're scaling the implementation supports. So we had to sort of look at, you know, what our training, and there's some job embedded coaching that goes along with it, and what that looks like when you bring in more coaches and more trainers. And so we brought in a PALS trainer who's experienced in developing PALS, you know, coaching and training to work directly with the coaching team. And the coaching team is at University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. And we're in the middle of developing resources to help, you know, a wider, you know, more coaches coming on, such as look for resources, feedback routines, coaching probes. So they're just kind of additional resources that the coaches can use as we scale up next year. But when we talk about scaling the product itself, you know, we are conducting kind of what we call preparation to scale activities, where we're conducting interviews, kind of similar to what Tony was mentioning at the school district and regional level. So we're aiming to interview some of the ESCs. And in that, our intent is to really understand, you know, what the literacy priorities and programs are currently in the schools, especially coming out of, you know, this pandemic period. We also want to understand, you know, who the champions and gatekeepers are as we're thinking about, you know, a strategic lens to scaling. And then next year, we'll be conducting market sizing and segmentation activities to better understand, you know, the target market for PALS RD. And all of this has really been informed by our work with the Learn Network and the IAT framework. One thing that I will touch on, actually, two things, is one of the important things that we're actually hearing this year in our work is the need to really deeply understand the context that we're aiming to implement in. And we're hearing a lot that, you know, that districts are really in need of programs and interventions that really fit into what they're doing already. And, you know, so when we went about integrating in the database decision-making routine, the progress monitoring measure, and then the differentiation aspect, we really looked at that usability, user-friendliness feature of the IAT to inform that piece of it. And we're also really looking at kind of some of the use of technology and how that can support our efforts as we're scaling in the research study, but also, you know, thinking more broadly about scaling. So we digitized, you know, a lot of our data collection tools, also the Maze CBM, we have a digital application for it now. And then we developed an online site for the teachers so that they can stay connected together after the training and have a place where they can, you know, access resources and things like that.
Oh, thank you. I just want to reflect on a couple of things that I heard woven through your comments. One is, you know, I think, Lauren, you spoke to the importance of personal relationships, especially when you're recruiting participants for research. And I think we all, I think, have experience with how challenging recruitment has been, especially in the current environment, and how important those personal relationships are. At the same time, I think we also recognize that to truly have the impact we want to have in the world and benefits for students, that we need to get beyond, you know, the number of people we could possibly, or districts we could possibly have direct relationships with ourselves. So part of what we're trying to do is think, I think as I think it was Tony mentioned, sort of what would it take to build that organizational infrastructure to be able to reach a broader audience, to build connections and build awareness and provide support for your products in a broader, in a much broader set of districts. And I think that brings me to one of the activities you mentioned you're going to be working on this year, Lauren, of thinking about segmentation. I think this may be another somewhat new way of thinking about scaling for educational researchers, is trying to identify what types of districts or schools or educators your product is the best fit for, and how you would reach them. What are some of the channels that would be most effective in reaching those people? That brings me to one last thought, which is that I think as we're doing this work, we run into these tensions between fidelity and the world as it is, and that sometimes we design our interventions based on a set of activities that we think are going to be most impactful for children. I think in reading interventions, the amount of exposure or time that we think students should be spending on these programs per week, and then run into these harsh realities that schools just don't allocate that much time or have the resources to support that. So then you have a couple of choices. One is to try to figure out, well, can I modify the implementation for my product or program to fit the realities that they're landing in? Or can we identify a segment of schools that are implementing our products or programs as intended, not just with support that we provide as researchers, but that have the capacity to do that and that fit with our mission. So that is one way that we're trying to think about segmentation. So I'm gonna put out my second question, but I think maybe we don't all have to speak to this one. I think this is a question that a lot of participants in this IESPI meeting might be grappling with, which is that we're in a very particular moment in time, that we're designing interventions for students after this traumatic event, but we know that the students who are in 5th grade now will not be in 5th grade by the time we've finished developing the intervention. And we know that, that there is a long road to recovery, but we don't know what that looks like. So my question is how you think about designing your programs for this sort of moving target, which is always the case to some extent, but I think it feels especially salient in the context of this project because we have this dual mission of scaling and working to ameliorate some of the setbacks caused by COVID. And I will open this to all of you, but if you don't speak up, then I'm gonna pick the first person on my list. Okay. Tony and Lynn, I think that was you.
Yeah, we've thought a lot about this, both in our internal project team, but also with others on the Learn Network. We've had a lot of conversations about this. And I don't know that I have a good, clean answer for it. I think we're aware of that there is this point in time issue that we're grappling with. In our case, I do think that so much of what we're focused on is not a problem that's just a problem that arose because of the pandemic. Like student fraction understanding has been a perennial problem in math for quite a long time. So I think that in some ways we're trying to accelerate learning by pairing these two programs together. And that was intentional, particularly given the challenges that were faced after the pandemic, with students having not full understanding maybe of some of the content and I think math is definitely has some unique qualities in the sense that the content, it really is topic or content driven in ways that reading may not be. And so it really does matter over time. The topics build upon each other. So if you don't have a full understanding of a topic in 3rd grade, it is going to potentially affect what you understand then in 5th grade. And so I think this idea of focusing on fractions in particular is to develop a strong foundation in fractions, whether you are a student who didn't fully understand content because of the pandemic, or it's just a general challenge of fractions overall. So I think in that way, we are aware of the point in time, but we're sort of trying to transcend that a bit by focusing on this perennial problem in math. And with the PALS pairing, that was, as Lynn described, intentional also with respect to the pandemic, for providing opportunities for a little bit more differentiation on some of those topics in math that you maybe didn't fully develop an understanding of, and particularly in PALS, but the structures carry over to CFI, the idea of students working together, peer-to-peer collaboration, which may have suffered a bit due to the pandemic. But both of those are still things that are really important moving forward with the pandemic. So I think also the fact that we are working in 5th grade, the students, when the pandemic hit that we're working with right now, would have been in 2nd grade. And it's, I think, a little bit different than if we had been focusing on a specific topic in high school, for example. So we're kind of trying to balance that or think about how that may or may not have an impact on what we're learning right now from our teachers. As Lynn mentioned, we are currently working with a group of teachers, and they haven't, when we've been interviewing them and talking with them, they haven't indicated that things are much different this year than they had been in prior years. Now, that just might be the particular students or teachers that we're working with and the districts that we're working in, but it doesn't seem like the pandemic is a strong influence in what they're thinking about with respect to CFI PALS. It's just from them, we're just getting sort of a general sense of this has always been helpful, or this is helpful now, and it will be in the future, and it was in the past. But we still want to pay attention to that because we recognize that there's this tension.
Yeah, I think what's really different now, post-pandemic, is the level of stress in the schools, and the sense, attention, and frustration among teachers about the resources and level of complexity in their day-to-day existences. So in the classroom. So I agree with Tony that the nature of the practices that we're working with, there's always been a need for better instruction on fractions and for classroom teachers to have a feasible way to address the heterogeneity in their classroom by differentiating instruction in an effective way. And I think that the teachers feel like these programs address those needs. And the challenge is more in the context of stressors that exist in the schools that have not always been there, not as intense, and hopefully will ease, but we're not really sure.
Thank you. I'm wondering if this question of timing is also particularly salient for the TRI team, just given that there's currently this increased level of funding available through the Pandemic Recovery Fund that can support things like tutoring programs, but it's unclear what's going to happen after the end of 2024. We hear that schools have to spend it down before it expires. So I'm curious if this plays any role in your thinking about designing your product and the resources that are available to schools right now versus where they might be a couple of years from now, or if that just feels too unpredictable, like, well, we'll just have to handle it when it comes.
Heather, do you want to speak to that?
Well, I can start off and then you can add on to it. I think when we wrote this proposal, we were really riding that highly effective tutoring, high dosage tutoring ride. We're part of the proven tutoring group. And so we were like, yes, this is the answer. We're going to provide this tutoring program and it's going to be wonderful. And there's going to be all this funding and it's going to work out really well for us. And what we discovered in some of our initial kind of market research interviews that we did as part of this is that a lot of schools we talked to weren't prepared to pay for a tutoring program. They weren't offering tutoring the way we thought maybe they would be. There were a lot of kind of just school-based constraints. Not the least of which is the current teacher shortage. And that was one of our reality checks from this program as well. We were, because of our history as a rural program, we were talking to someone and he made the very valid point that in some of these rural areas, if there is somebody available that can provide this level of skilled tutoring, they're not going to let them be a tutor. They're going to pull them in and put them into a classroom. And so I think one of the things we have found is that tutoring groups are struggling to even find tutors. And so that has led us to really broaden our scope of, well, who could use this and how can we create this in a way that it works for multiple sets of people?
Yeah, I would agree with that, Heather. I think, when we think about having built this digital application, this digital platform to deliver TRI kind of in its intended scope and sequence, which is important for us. Like we've actually programmed it to where it should be a little bit easier for a range of implementers to use TRI with individual and hopefully even small groups of students. And kind of the way that Heather and our coach Teresa have built it is that teachers, and I'm using teachers really broadly. I mean, we are talking, it might be a parent volunteer, it might be a high school student volunteer, as we've said, that they're able to understand like where we call them our on and off ramps. So where is a student? Can we easily identify the foundational skills that a student needs to build? Okay, now we can direct that person, that implementer, where to start that student in TRI, provide the lessons that we need, keep them moving through TRI quickly, which pacing is always an issue with implementation of TRI. We don't want anybody to hold students back. They need to move students faster through our intervention program. And so that way we can off-ramp them quickly too. It's designed that students move through our program quickly. And some of the things that we're hearing from districts who we're going to be implementing with is they have fifth graders and fourth graders who they want to use this program because they're seeing that students don't have the foundational skills that they need. And this is true pre-pandemic, it's true post-pandemic. And I think something that we think a lot about is strong evidence-based programs like TRI are important because child outcomes need to be better than before COVID-19. It's not good enough that we just quote unquote catch kids back up. We need to make sure that we've caught this new generation back up and that they're exceeding previous generations. And that's something that we'll be actually hopefully being able to actually test the trajectory of students pre-pandemic versus post-pandemic using our program.
Right. Thank you. We've got about 8 minutes left, so I want to turn to a couple of questions that have come from our audience. One is around implementation fidelity. The question is interested in hearing more about how the projects have measured fidelity of their professional development and teacher implementation. And I want to just mention that one of the sort of lessons learned that we heard from a member of our advisory network, Rob Horner, who has with his colleagues scaled his intervention, the positive behavioral intervention system, into 25,000 schools. So he's had experience figuring out how to do this, was to help schools figure out how to measure implementation fidelity for themselves. And I'm not going to do justice to how he went about this, but his basic point was that, how to empower the community of users for your system with a scaffolding blueprints that enable them to take ownership of measuring implementation fidelity, so that that you can shift that off your plate at some point. But I just wanted to mention that because I thought that was a really interesting piece of advice. And now I'm going to ask maybe Lauren, if you'd like to speak to this one.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, so I think one of the other kind of pieces in those conversations we were having in the Learn Network is that, we can look at implementation fidelity, obviously to inform our research, right? So we want to see, the level of implementation across teachers that will have some bearing on our findings, but also we can use those tools to support our implementation supports. And so that's what we did. So there was already an existing fidelity checklist rubric from the existing PALS program. So we modified it slightly to fit it into PALS reading with differentiation, adding in the differentiation component. But that also serves as a basis for the coaching resources and supports that we're using with the coaches. So, the fidelity is collected at certain time points in the implementation process. This year, we did about once a month. Next year, we'll do about 3 times through the duration of implementation. But the other times coaches are in the classroom, they're kind of doing almost like walkthrough, like a walkthrough routine and like supporting teachers and meeting with the teachers, but they can still use those same probes to really like kind of guide what they're their walkthroughs are. We're also looking at fidelity to coaching. This isn't something that we actually did this year, but we developed the tool for it. And we wanted, as we're thinking about the scaled up component related to implementation supports, to understand, as teachers are being coached, how can we like adhere to, fidelity with respect to coaching. So for that, we've been looking a bit at some tools. For instance, there's a fidelity coaching routine from the National Center for Systemic Improvement and a couple of other resources. Again, we're not 100% sure we're going to utilize something like this, but it's definitely something that we're talking about when we think about implementation supports.
Thank you. Anyone else want to speak to that question? If not, I'm going to share a very thought-provoking question, which I think asks us to look both backwards and forwards. This is from Jim Buell, who writes, my question relates to designed versus emergent aspects of technology integration into classrooms curricula, particularly amid and beyond COVID, where the very definition of classroom has come to mean something rather different than before. How are the Starry Pals and other projects evolving in ways that might be different from what they might have been if COVID hadn't happened? How is what we think about scaling more problematic and perhaps more richly problematized than our starting points, either in this or prior projects in which your various innovations first came to be?
I was starting to type an answer to Jim. So we've mentioned this a little bit with TRI. We've been so hyper-focused on the classroom teacher, and for good reason. I mean, classroom teachers are incredibly important. And I don't think if COVID had happened, we would have considered as strongly as we're currently considering this idea that anybody should be able to pick up an evidence-based intervention like TRI and use it effectively with students. I think we would have really shied away from high school students, college students, and other implementers who maybe don't have a level of teaching reading experience that classroom teachers often have, not always, but often. And so I think COVID has taught us that we have to look outside, like who's providing supports to students. Okay, get these products in the hands of those people. Doesn't matter who they are. Can your product withstand who that implementer is? And I think so that's something that we're considering a lot.
That's really interesting. I think it comes back to this point about how the stresses that COVID has placed on educators and on schools and teachers can force us to make trade-offs that we might otherwise not have been willing to make, or to accept realities that we might have resisted previously. That's a really interesting point. Any other reflections on this one? Okay, well, it looks like there is that a new question. No. I think I will close by asking each of the teams to just very quickly share where you would like to be a year or 2 years down the road. What would success look like for your project looking ahead? You can pick your time frame. And I'll start with Lauren again, since you're on my left, upper left.
Yeah, and I'll actually jump into a little bit and address the prior question too, because one thing I didn't mention yet is that one of the things that, we're kind of hearing anecdotally, but also that is a little bit like, talked about in the research is this notion of, maybe it's because of the pandemic or not, but that there is this more variation in classrooms, so children maybe did not have the same, learning loss, maybe look different for one child versus another. And so that's where like that differentiation aspect really comes in. And where, like something like PALS, where students are in a peer tutoring model working together and using their own text, we can help, support that. So I just think that kind of an interesting aspect now is really like the nature of what classrooms, look like kind of in terms of skills as well, like coming out of the pandemic. In a year from now, we would have wrapped up our CT year. So we would be, coming out of that and looking at that data and would have, we'd be working on our preparation to scale plan. So, have conducted our, market sizing and segmentation activities and the various interviews we're doing with educators at different levels. So, I look forward to continuing the work next year and looking at how PALS RD looks in terms of, when we're going to evaluate it in an RCT year.
Thank you. I'm going to ask one sentence for each team because we're out of time. Margaret, you go next.
Oh gosh, I have more than one sentence in my head. I guess I will speak to a question that came up about the conflict between marketability and the theory of change of the intervention. And I'll say that a year from now, I hope we've found ways to make adaptations that align with both. And that's my sentence.
Perfect. Mary, Heather?
Yeah, I mean, a year from now, we're going to know if it works with a range of implementers, and we're going to know who can use this new product the best. And hopefully we're going to have enough market research that we really have a plan for moving forward and who to approach and how to approach them with a product that we have a lot of confidence in.
Perfect. And Tony or Lynn?
Go ahead, John.
I think it's very similar to everybody else. Just a year from now, we will have done a sort of a quasi-experimental test study of the program or the combined program, have a better understanding of how it can be implemented in schools, and then looking at ways in markets and things for scaling.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all. I think this was a really, really riveting discussion. So I appreciate all of your contributions and sharing your reflections. We did mean to put up a slide with our QR code. So in case anyone is still hanging out and wants to scan the QR code for accessing our website, let me just put our slides back up. They got the right version this time. And here we are. Thank you all for joining us. I hope this was, hope you all got as much out of this as I did. Thank you.